Hello, class. Today we're going to look at the management skill of communication. So as we go through the slides today, we're really going to focus on this idea of supportive communication and look at the attributes that help us become better communicators. So the question is, what makes communication so difficult? If you look at the communication model in general, it's a pretty simple model. I have something to communicate, so as the sender, I formulate my communication, put my thoughts into words, and whether that's face-to-face or email, and I deliver that message to the receiver, and the receiver should receive it like I intend, and they potentially provide me some feedback letting me know that they've received the message. So the process is pretty simple, but it's oftentimes a challenge to communicate effectively when we're talking about communicating negative messages. How do I do that and still maintain a relationship? How do I communicate positive things with quality, to have some quality behind that positive message and not just simply saying, good job, but having some specifics and some kind of meat behind that message. So today we're going to look at what we can do, whether it's positive communication, negative communication. What are some things that we should think about when we're communicating to others? And really this applies to whether I'm face-to-face communication or, through electronic means or a written document. Right? We want to think about these things regardless on the mode of communication. Some of the things that make communication difficult in organizations is the technology. So we rely heavily on technology to help us communicate. We send lots of emails, lots of text messages, and so we've really lost that face-to-face communication. And sometimes we don't have a choice. We're in different locations, in different countries, and so technology obviously is a great thing, but we've kind of lost kind of how to effectively communicate. So we still want to think about these attributes regardless of if we're using technology or not. So some of the problems with technology or the use of electronic communication is that sometimes we put a lot of information with not a lot of quality. So we try to put a whole bunch of stuff out there, and we forget kind of the details, or we put too much detail out there and no one how do we know if they read the email, or how do we know that they understood the message, right? And so we lack some of that feedback with the electronic communication. And probably one of the bigger challenges is that with electronic communication, we don't have that those nonverbals. We don't hear the tone. We don't see the other person, their expression, their body language. And so we can definitely misinterpret the information because we don't have the nonverbals to help support the message. So those are some things that we just want to kind of keep in mind. And when we are communicating through email or text messages or whatever the electronic mean might be, that we think about how can we make sure that the message is clear, is getting across how I want it to, and how do I maintain that relationship at the same time. If we're not concerned about that, if we don't work on our communication kind of skill, you can see kind of what can happen here. So if we're unskillful in our delivery, it can really damage the relationship between the two individuals, and that can lead to kind of avoidance in the future. I don't want to communicate with this person anymore, and so maybe I start avoiding it, or I am really restricted on how often I communicate with someone because of that relationship. All right, so those are some kind of things to definitely be concerned about. Supportive communication really focuses on trying to overcome two obstacles in communication. So the first one is this idea of defensiveness. So when we are communicating with someone, we want to get them to listen to what we have to say, participate in that conversation. And if someone gets on the defensive, typically what happens is that they stop listening, right? So they they stop listening to what we're talking about or what we're our message, and they're thinking about defending themselves, right? Thinking about all the reasons why this happened, or all the excuses or whatever it might be, and they're no longer listening to the message. And so now the conversation is kind of pointless at that point. So we want to get the person to listen to what we have to say and participate in that conversation. And so we want to avoid defensiveness for those reasons. The other obstacle supportive communication is trying to overcome is this idea of disconfirmation. Disconfirmation is when someone feels that they're not very valuable anymore. Based on this message, I now don't feel worthy. I don't feel qualified, maybe insignificant, right? And that should not be the point of the communication. Even when it's negative communication, the idea is that I'm providing this constructive feedback to this person with the intent that they improve, right? I want them to improve, and so I need to tell them about this in order for them to be able to improve. So what can I do? How can I frame this message so they leave the message feeling valued, feeling like they had a say, and feeling motivated to make these adjustments, right? And so supportive communication gives us some tools to try to accomplish that, to try to avoid these obstacles, and to keep that person feeling worthy, and to keep that person listening, and to maintain that relationship, a respectful relationship, regardless if the communication is positive or negative. So we're going to go through these 8 attributes. As we go through the slides, you'll see there's some examples that I'll use, kind of would you choose option A or B, and it will help kind of illustrate the different attributes as we go through, and we'll wrap up with supportive listening. So the first kind of example, I'm going to read these and you kind of think about, which one do you think is better? They're both good, okay, but which one would be better to use? So A, I know that you've been doing a great job as supervisor, but there's just one small thing I want to raise with you about a customer complaint, probably not too serious. Or B, I have some concerns about several aspects of your performance on the job, and I would like to discuss them with you. Right? When you think about those two statements, really both of them are fine, right? But B is better, right? And there's a main reason why B is better is that last line in A kind of ruins A. This idea of, it's probably not too serious, right? So we want to make sure that our communication is congruent. Right? And that's the first attribute of supportive communication. This idea of congruence is that what we say is matching how we are thinking and how we are feeling. So supportive communication needs to be honest communication. We want to make sure that, we're having this conversation with this person because it is important. All right. So by me ending the conversation with, but it's not that big a deal. Right? It now communicates to the other person, it's not that big a deal. I don't really have to pay attention, or I'm going to kind of blow it off because they kind of imply that it's not that significant. All right, so we don't want to send that message. Supportive communication needs to be honest, but we also want to make sure that we're matching it with some of these other attributes, because honesty by itself, a lot of times will put somebody on the defensive. So we want to be aware of that. But it's important to know that we do want honest communication as part of our supportive communication kind of tools. All right, the next one, would you choose A or B? When one of your subordinates called the other day to complain that you had criticized his work in public, I became concerned. I suggest that you sit down with that subordinate to work through any hard feelings that might still exist. Or B, of course, that you're wrong to have criticized your subordinate's work in public. That's a sure way to create antagonism and lower morale. All right, so hopefully you look at those two and say, you know what, A is probably better. And you're right if you said that. And the reason why A is better is because it follows the attribute of being descriptive. So with supportive communication, we really want to make sure that we're describing the behavior, that we're focused on how that behavior made me feel or how that behavior made someone else feel, what was the impact of that behavior, right? So we want to talk through those things to help the person really get a good understanding, why this behavior is important to focus on. All right, so another kind of technique that's used in this idea of descriptive communication is the XYZ approach. And what the XYZ approach says is it kind of helps you, it's this model to follow. So you would say, when you did X, I felt Y, and Z was the result, or whatever. And I fill in those blanks, and that's a good way to practice being descriptive, right? So again, the idea is that it helps the other person not feel like they're being evaluated, right? That it's kind of not focusing on them so much, but more of the behavior, more of the circumstance, right? Again, to try to avoid some of this defensiveness. A or B, I received complaints from some of your customers that you have not followed company standards in being responsive to their requests. Or B, you don't seem to be motivated to do a good job anymore, Carol. All right, so this one should be pretty easy. A is the correct answer. And the reason why A is better, because it focuses on the problem and not the person. You can see in B, we're really kind of blaming Carol. We're kind of, feels like you're just pointing that finger at Carol and saying, you're the reason why this is happening type of thing. Where A is more focused on the problem, receiving complaints from customers that you're not following company standards. That is more problem oriented and not focused on these kind of personal traits and making these assumptions that you're not motivated, right? And so again, we start making comments like that. That's a good way to get that person to be defensive. And now we're going to kind of miss the opportunity to maybe provide some solutions or some, have that conversation. A or B, I would like to see the following changes in your performance, and then you kind of list them. Or B, I have some ideas for helping you to improve, but first, what do you suggest? Right? There's nothing necessarily wrong with A. B is better, though, in this to kind of help illustrate some of the supportive communication. And B is better because it's this idea of validating. It's validating because it's saying, what do you suggest? It's trying to get that other person involved in the conversation so they feel like they have a say, that they're able to add kind of value to the problem or to the conversation. So validating helps others feel recognized and understood. And this helps maybe overcome some of that potential disconfirmation, that obstacle that I talked about at the beginning. So when we validate someone, we can do this in a lot of different ways. The egalitarian approach says that I really try to make someone feel like we're on the same level, right? So if this is a boss talking to a subordinate, making sure, making that subordinate feel like we're on the same level. Maybe I get out from behind my desk and we talk, side by side, or we go over to a conference room and talk, on the same side of the table. We don't have that barrier of that table or of that desk, because that really says, I'm the boss, you're the subordinate. In other conversations, maybe I want that to be communicated. Maybe I want that person to know I'm the boss, they're the subordinate, and so I would sit with that desk in between me, right? But in the case that I'm trying to help the person feel valued and recognized, maybe I come out from behind my desk. Having a flexible conversation, right? So if I ask them some of their ideas, make sure that you're willing to actually put some of those ideas into play. All right, so being flexible in the approach and be willing to not only ask them for those ideas, but go along with those ideas if it makes sense, if they're good ideas. Two-way conversations is another way to help make the other person feel validated. I'm not just saying, here's the problem, here's what you need to do to change it, but now, here's what it looked like, right? Here's what I saw. What were you thinking when that happened, right? And getting kind of their side of the story and getting them involved can go a long way at helping that person feel validated. The last one on the screen talks about being based on agreement. So when kind of starting with the positive, starting with the strengths. So if we're coming in to have a difficult conversation, I might start that conversation with things that this person has done well, right? The positives. And that gets that person listening. We can all agree on the good things that, we're doing. And so that might help lead in and get that person listening before I go into kind of the negatives. When we think about kind of the opposite, what are some things that we do to invalidate someone? And we want to recognize that when we're not giving someone our full attention, that makes the other person feel that they're not as important to whatever else you're focused on, right? So if our computers are out, if our phones are out, and we're constantly just looking over and coming back to the person, just that small glance, if your phone buzzes and I look over and it takes me a second, or anymore, if you have a watch on that's connected to your phone, you're looking at your watch and kind of still shaking your head because you're still listening, but just that motion of looking elsewhere kind of communicates that you're not fully focused on what we're talking about. And that can really make someone feel not as valuable, especially if it happens time and time again. So we want to think about some of those nonverbals that can potentially make the other person feel not as valued. And not that we're meaning that, I'm not meaning that this text or this buzz is more important than you, but that's what it does communicate to the other person. Supportive communication is also specific, so it identifies a specific scenario, and what this is trying to avoid is this idea of global communication and saying you always do this or you never do that. We want to kind of hone in on specific examples of when this behavior happened. If I go in and say you're always late to a meeting or always late to our meetings, this person essentially could get focused on that word always. And now if you said that to me, you're always late to meetings, I'm now thinking, well, no, I'm not. I wasn't late last week. Right? And so now it's kind of defensive, right? I'm trying to prove you wrong that I'm not always late. And now that's where my focus goes, right? So now the communication or the conversation goes to us kind of proving when I am late or when I'm not late. And really the point of the conversation is to try to fix this, right? To say, all right, you've been late, this time, that time, and whatever, right? This is really impacting the group, right? Now I start to be descriptive and specific about the instances, right? It helps us stay focused on that problem and not the words always or never, or kind of that global communication. So we really want to make sure that we are specific in our communication. Supportive communication is also conjunctive, meaning that the conversation should flow nicely back and forth. And what I say should be connected to what you just said, right? I'm not just kind of during my airtime talking about what I want to talk about, and the other person gets a chance to talk about whatever they want to talk about, right? We want to make sure that there is that connection and that flow. Disjunctive communication happens when the other person doesn't feel like they're going to get an opportunity to talk. The one person is talking and taking up all the airtime, and so because they feel like they have the lack of opportunity to talk, they're constantly interrupting, or when it is their turn to talk, they're going to get everything that they want to talk about out there because they don't know when they'll get a chance to talk again, right? It's just very disjunctive in that sense. If we don't control the topic and we're going from one topic to the next without completing a topic, we really aren't going to get anywhere. So when we talk about how to create conjunctive communication, we want to make sure that we are taking time to take turns speaking, right? So I'm going to talk about what I think the problem is or some of the impacts, and then I'm going to allow that other person to kind of have a say, right? To get what their opinion out or what they think the solution should be, right? So if I really focus on validating the other person and making it two-way communication, then I naturally allow for that kind of taking turns type of style. Making sure that you are managing the time, again, not talking for too long with it, before you allow the other person to come in. That really does limit the amount of interruptions, right? So I can get my complete thought out and then allow someone else or the other party to get their thoughts out there. And then this idea of topic control, thinking about, if I'm trying to have a conversation with someone, how many topics should I try to cover? If this is a performance review, there's several things that this person needs to work on, really thinking about how many topics can I cover in this 1 hour meeting, right? Without it feeling overwhelming. If I try to cover every topic, then they might start feeling like they're getting beat up. They're not, man, do I do anything right? Right. So I want to think about how many topics can I put out there on the table and complete, right? So we want to talk about whatever the problem is. We want to allow time for that other person to weigh in, and we want to really focus on solutions, action plans. What can we do to change, right? And this should be both parties involved, right? So we want to think about those things in order to make this a more conjunctive conversation. You can see, this continuum of conjunctive statements. The most conjunctive you can see is a statement that refers to an immediate statement that was just made. And then you can see all the way down to disjunctive when, the other person refers to nothing that has been said or that the parties share in common, right? It's just whatever they want to talk about. And you see this a lot of times with little kids are good examples of disjunctive. I'll listen to kids in the back seat and they're talking about their weekend. And instead of, my son saying, "Oh, that's awesome. Did you have so much fun doing those things?" The minute that person's done, he's talking about whatever topic he wants to talk about, right? And there's really no connection between the two. So really thinking about those conjunctive statements. Another kind of A or B scenario. A, I must tell you that I'm disappointed in your performance. Or B, several of our employees seem to be unhappy with how you've been performing lately. In this situation, A is the better of the two because of the I statements. I must tell you that I'm disappointed, all right? And that's this idea of owning your statements, all right? So ownership conveys responsibility. If I think it's important enough to have the conversation, then I need to own those statements. Others might be thinking the same thing as I am, but if they're not in the room, I don't want to try to kind of push the responsibility on to others. A lot of times when we have kind of this disowned communication, the listener starts thinking, well, who's they, right? Who's talking about this, and why aren't they talking to me about this, right? And so it can kind of get confusing, and really kind of changes the focus more on the kind of the who they are versus the problem that we're trying to kind of identify. The last communication attribute is this idea of active listening. Active listening is an important part of communication. It is difficult to stay focused on a conversation, on a lecture, right? And so we need to practice, how can I stay focused on this conversation without my mind wandering, right? And so it does take some practice. It's a very important skill for managers to have, to be able to effectively listen to others and not always be the one that's talking, right? But really listening to what our employees have to say. We're going to talk about kind of 4 different active listening responses. And you can see advising, deflecting, probing, and reflecting are the 4 responses that are that can be used depending on the scenario, depending on the type of communication. But you did an assessment which should have identified kind of your primary response type. All right, and so I want you to kind of look at your response type And if advising is your primary response type, which is very common to, once you hear, if someone tells you a problem, we're very quick to solve that problem for that person, right? We provide this advice. I want you to think about what happens if I would maybe use a different response type first, right? It's not saying I can't eventually get to the advising, but think about the advantages of maybe deflecting first and then advising, or maybe probing a little bit and then providing the advice. All right, so we'll kind of talk about that as we go through each of them. So advising is providing a solution, providing directions to how to solve something. The advantage is that you get the control now, right? So as I'm providing the advice now, I have control over the topic. The disadvantage is that it can produce dependence, right? If you always provide advice, or if you think about someone who's always giving advice, if you have a problem, I go to that person, I know they're gonna be able to solve it, right? And so we start maybe relying on those people, and we stop kind of thinking for ourselves sometimes. So again, we want to think about, sometimes it's appropriate to provide advice right away. But is the person really wanting advice, right? I always share the example that, parents are really good at providing advice. And I remember, when I was a young adult, if I had a problem, I would if I wanted advice, I'd call my dad. He always, would be very logical in his response to me. But a lot of times I didn't really want advice. I just wanted someone to sympathize and empathize with me and be like, you know what, that does suck that happened to you, or whatever it might be. And so if that was what I was needing, then I knew I'd call my mom or call a friend, and they would provide that comfort that I was looking for. And then most likely after I, got that comfort I was looking for, then I'd call my dad and he would help me, solve the issue that I was having. But we want to be careful that, not everyone is looking for advice. So we don't want to just freely give it if that's not what they're truly looking for. So just a quick little exercise. We're going to use this scenario for all four response types. Just provide an example of what a statement would look like if I was providing a particular response type. So here, the scenario is that I can't stand my boss. He's the most autocratic, demanding person you can imagine. I've never worked around anyone who cared less for his employees than he does. His complete insensitivity and lack of humanity have made this a miserable place to work. Right? If you were a person that would, if someone's telling you this, right, they're expressing these feelings to you about their boss, and I'm prone to advise right away, an advising statement might say, man, if I were you, I'd quit, or maybe I might say, if I were you, I'd talk to him, see if you can get a meeting with him and talk about how you feel, right? These are all advising statements, right? Trying to help solve the problem for your friend or for this person. Deflecting is the second response type, and deflecting is switching the focus from the communicator's problem to one selected by the listener. So deflecting really is, if someone's telling you a problem, you would say, you know what, I completely know how you feel. This same thing happened to me, right? And then I kind of go into that problem. So now I'm shifting the focus from your problem to a problem that I had that is connected, right? And so this is appropriate to try to provide some reassurance to the other person, right? So I know how you feel. I've been down that road before too, right? And I kind of show them. And so it provides reassurance maybe that, okay, this has happened to other people have survived this, whatever it might be. What we don't want it to feel like is that we're one-upping someone, right? That we're implying that their issue is not as important as to what happened to me, right? And this can sound like, you think that's bad? Listen to what happened to me. And then you go into it. And now it's kind of making the other person's problem feel maybe a little more insignificant. And that's really not the idea or the goal of deflecting. So I might deflect first to provide some reassurance to the other person before giving advice, right? So, hey, I know exactly what you're talking about. This happened to me. this is how I handled it, right? And then I provide that advice. And so now to add some credibility to what I'm talking about, that I'm not just saying, this is what I think you should do. Now I have some kind of proof that, hey, this worked for me, right? And so I might deflect and then give advice to help kind of not only with that reassurance, but also, to aid in some credibility behind my advice. All right, so if we go back to our solution, I can't stand my boss. A deflecting statement but might be, I totally understand where you're coming from. A couple of years ago, I had a boss that came in every morning and was just in a bad mood, demanded that I get him coffee right away, and go into kind of what that, what those specifics were. That would be deflecting, right? If you're good at deflecting, you're going to bring it back to the original problem, right? So I know what you're talking about. I had a boss like that. This is what he did, so let's talk about what you can do in your situation, right? I want to bring it back to this problem to make sure that we stay focused on the right thing. And now maybe I help solve this problem and give some advice at that point. Probing is asking questions about what the communicator said. The main purpose or main advantage of probing is that you gather more information, right? So I ask questions to obtain more details, more specifics about the situation, and then maybe I can give better advice now, right? Because I have more details, I have the big picture, the full picture, right? And now my advice might be better that I have those details. All right. What we don't want it to feel like is that the communicator has to justify everything, and so sometimes if we have too many why questions, well, why did you do that? Why didn't you do this? Why'd that happen? It makes it feel like that person feels kind of defensive and they have to justify everything. And really probing is used just to sincerely gather more information. So if the other person's not a good communicator and they're not very skillful in being descriptive and being specific and staying focused on the problem, probing might help get them to communicate those things. All right, so I might ask, well, how did that make you feel? Or what else was going on as this was happening, right? To get kind of a better idea, better sense of the environment and the situation. All right, and then once I have that information, now maybe I can give them some better advice now that I have the full picture. All right, so if I'm probing here, I can't stand my boss, he's the most autocratic, I might ask, well, what's something specific that he does that makes you feel like this? And that would be a kind of a probing type of statement there, a question in order to gain some more information. The last response type is reflecting. So reflecting is simply just mirroring back to the communicator what they just said. All right, so the idea is that I'm paraphrasing for clarification, really. So someone says something, to make sure that I truly understand what they just said, I'm going to state it back to them in my own words. And in that case, the positive is that if I misheard them or I misinterpret what they're saying, we can correct that right away. No, that's not what I'm saying at all, right? And now they can clarify, and now potentially I can give better advice now. Right? But if I don't reflect and I don't paraphrase, maybe I give advice when I don't really truly understand what they're saying in the first place, but we don't know that, right? So if I'm not sure I'm totally grasping everything they're saying, then, reflecting becomes a good option. But if my only response type is reflecting, it starts to sound like, that you're not really listening. Are you really paying attention? Yes, I just said that. If it's, so you're saying, da-da-da. Yes, that's what I just said. So I want to make sure that I'm truly just using it to clarify before moving on to, helping them solve the problem or helping them, to empathize with them or whatever it might be. All right, so if I use a reflecting statement in this scenario, I'd simply say, so what you're saying is that your boss is a jerk, or so what you're saying is that you don't like your job and you want to leave, and then they might say, no, I love my job. I don't want to leave. I don't know what to do about my boss, right? And so again, that reflecting statement can provide that clarification for that party. All right, so that's supportive communication. Those are the attributes. So hopefully you have a better understanding of what they are, kind of what they look like, what they sound like, and help you become a better communicator. All right, any questions? Let me know.